Hi, this time I'm going to share some funny tanking moments in games that I thought of. This video came out as a sort of idea after watching one of Drudenfusz's videos. I'm going to put a link in the description below. In that video, she basically said that she enjoyed tanking, that tanking was quite fun. So it got me thinking of tanking in tabletop role-playing games, but also in video games. In fact, I think this video is going to be a bit more focused on funny video game tanking moments, but at the same time I'm also going to give some tabletop examples and what I think of both the experiences. Well, a lot of you are already familiar with the term of tanking. It was made popular through MMORPGs. It's basically that particular role where you choose a class, maybe a warrior or a paladin or any sort of high constitution or high hit points class with a lot of defense or protection or armor class due to your shields and your physical armor. In some other ways it can also be substituted or replaced by some other means of protection, but most of it is that huge guy with lots of armor and lots of hit points, and you can usually take a lot of punishment. So it got me thinking as the different types of tanking that is in tabletop role-playing games and in video games, because I think that the main difference lies in the freedom that you have in tabletop role-playing games. It lets you be a bit more creative. Let me give you some video games examples first, on how you can do some things despite the limitations of the system. Because, for example, I remember this time in a long time ago in Final Fantasy XI. In that game it was quite difficult to get a white mage in your party. Sometimes there weren't too many white mages at a particular time, and you almost always, if you wanted to have like an efficient party, you needed your white mage so that the tank and, if necessary, the other members in the party could be healed. But sometimes there were no white mages, so you usually, if you wanted to make some experience points, you needed to settle for some secondary healers like a red mage and summoner, if I'm not mistaken. Sometimes there were beastmasters that also had like a white mage as a sub class. And I think a lot of players sometimes missed a lot of experience points in a particular day because they were a bit obsessed on getting a white mage. I remember seeing guys that spent hours just sitting around and they didn't join parties or make their own parties because they didn't have a white mage. But I thought it was better to have some not as efficient or as effective healers, depends on the situation, filling that particular role. Because even if you weren't going to make too many experience points because you would need more downtime, more resting between battles, you could still get some experience points, and that was the important thing, instead of just sitting down and gaining no experience points. I remember a moment where it was me as a paladin, and we had a warrior, a thief, black mage, and two red mages. Those two red mages were our substitution or replacement for white mages, for a white mage. And so they didn't have enough mana points to heal us. They usually ran out of spells quite quickly, and their healing spells were not as powerful, but they did a pretty decent job. And I remember this time that there was this really powerful enemy, and the red mages already spent all of their mana points. I think we got ambushed. It was quite possible for you that you were fighting this enemy and another enemy approach from some other area, usually because someone trained that enemy, that is, they pulled that enemy and maybe they got away from it or they died, and the enemy, as it went back to its spot, sometimes your party aggroed that enemy. Of course, a lot of you already know that aggro means that you attract the attention or get that enemy angry, or you're the objective of his aggression, and he starts to attack you. So after dealing with the first enemy, both red mages did not have magic points. I think one of them had a few, So it was up to me and the warrior to handle this enemy. So what we basically did is that the warrior started to use provoke, which is basically like aggroing the enemy, drawing that enemy towards him, and he started to fight this enemy, but the enemy dealt quite a bit of damage, and it was obvious that the warrior would soon be in great danger. So me as a paladin, just before he was about like 20% of his hit points left, more or less, I started to heal him like crazy, because paladins also have healing spells, but they still do not make very good healers. And I started to use provoke as well on the enemy. So I managed to pull the enemy away from the warrior, and then the enemy started to attack me, and my hit points were started to go down and down and down. And just when I was about to die, not so close but just enough, the warrior started to provoke the enemy again, and we actually managed to kill that enemy that way, juggling the enemy. So that's a creative way to work within the limits of the system. And I'm still not talking about the funny moments. This is just like some positive examples. This can also be applied to other video games like World of Warcraft. In the vanilla version, I remember I did almost the exact same thing, and that time I used blessings and healing, of course, to attract the attention of the enemy, while the warrior at first drew the enemy through taunt. Yes, the taunt, and another strike that is used to provoke the enemy. And then I started to gain the attention of the enemy, and when the enemy was about to kill me, I think it was divine protection, that invincibility shield that keeps you safe for a certain amount of time, and the enemy couldn't damage me. And in the meantime, the warrior once again taunted the enemy into attacking him, and we got rid of that enemy that way. But there are some other examples in video games that are a bit more creative when the system allows you a bit more freedom. For example, in action role-playing games, there are also some good examples of getting somewhat creative with tanking. It was Champions of Norath, EverQuest Champions of Norath for the PlayStation 2. One time we were 3 players, and one player was the ranger, the other one I think it was like the wizard, yes, the wizard, and I was playing as the dark elf, that is basically sort of like a necromancer knight, and he was the tankiest of all of us in the 3. I was playing as the dark elf, and there was this very dangerous part with a lot of spiders. They basically kept coming up they were like spawning points. They were like holes or passageways into levels below, and spiders kept coming from those areas. So what we basically did, we created sort of like a choke point, like a bottleneck type of situation. I started to push barrels from this side, and the other players did it as well, so we had a very narrow place. And our plan was basically for me to stand in the middle of those bunch of barrels, those 2 groups of barrels, and I would pull the spiders toward that particular choke point or bottleneck, and that way the spiders won't be attacking me. And they were quite nasty. They dealt a lot of poison damage. But if things started to get too tough, basically the wizard and the ranger would crush and slash their way through the barrels at the sides, because you could break the barrels, and they would start to flank the spiders using spells and arrows. And that's basically what we did, and that was another creative way in handle a tanking type of situation or tactic. There were other less elegant ways in Baldur's Gate for PlayStation 2 that is very different from the PC version. I think it's called Dark Alliance, if I remember correctly. Sometimes you could actually push the enemies. So for example, maybe this is an enemy, and here we had the squishy character. You can only play 2 players with that game, and we were playing, I was the dwarf, and the other player was the sorceress, if I'm not mistaken. There was the arcane archer and the sorceress, and the player was basically standing here, and I was like the mid shield, the tank, and this enemy tried to get towards the sorceress. So I basically started to push against the enemy, but the enemy always had the upper hand when it comes to pushing. If I'm not mistaken, in that game it was very difficult for you to push the enemy, so it was almost like sort of like a game of Pong, but really up close, and I had to like move around to stop that enemy from getting to the sorceress, and that was pretty fun. But you can see the difference when it comes to tabletop role-playing games, because there are basically no limits within the context of the system. You can try almost anything that you want, because in a similar barricade type of situation, you had the one time I was playing as the paladin, and we basically used a couple of tables and other furniture to create a sort of like a barricade, and I stood once again in the middle. That was basically, as you can see, one of my favorite tactics when I acted as a tank. I always create like a choke point or a bottleneck. It's typical, a lot of players do that. But we also made some holes in the table so that you could basically stick spears and pikes and pole arms through the poles, through those improvised barricades. We were fighting goblins, and so I basically went towards the goblins, and I made a lot of noise and then ran back to the choke point. It was a very risky situation because the paladin wasn't very fast. Luckily, I just had to make a lot of noise, and the goblins were quite easy to provoke. So we pulled them back into this area, and I was just handling one goblin. No, it was 3 goblins at the time, but I had a bonus due to cover because of the barricades that we made at the side. And the other members in the party were using spears and pole arms to poke at them from through the holes in the barricades. That's a really creative way of handling a tanking type of situation. And I've seen other players, I didn't do it, but I've seen in other role-playing games, and this basically works in any role-playing games. I think role-playing game. I think it was in Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition. I was looking at it in a convention, and they basically had this ability. I don't remember if it was a spell. I have actually never played 4th edition. I've only seen other people play it, and this ability or spell basically allowed you to switch places with another party member. So I saw that the fighter was at the front fighting, and when the enemies were just too much, where they were hurting him quite a bit, he switched places with a rogue almost like instantaneously, and then the fighter could drink some healing potions. And as the rogue managed to take care of the enemies in front, they switched places again, and the fighter replaced the rogue. So that's another creative way of handling some tanking moments. But now I'm going to talk about some what we consider the most ridiculous and potentially funny moments in that I've seen in my gaming career. I'm going to share a tabletop experience and 2 video game experiences, because I've seen other bad examples of tanking that you would say, why would you do that? But they were not as impressive or as flashy in their ridiculousness. That is, it was some stupid error, like maybe the fighter forgot to drink a healing potion when he actually had one left, or they forgot, the player character forgot to use some sort of protective spell or healing spell. But these 3 examples, I always laugh, or sorry, like they make me smile a bit when I think about them. The first example, there was this guy that was terrible at reading maps, and basically like he lacked a bit of like a spatial reasoning of sorts, more than anything in games, but you could also see it in other areas of his life. And he was somewhat of a troll most of the time. He actually did a really trollish thing, that he was the type of guy that would tell you that he would go to your house to play, that we had the group waiting for him, and he was like, oh, I'm going over there to play Dungeons and Dragons with you guys, but I'm going to arrive there in about an hour. And you waited an hour, and you talk to him through the phone, and you ask what happens, why aren't you here yet? And back then we didn't have cell phones, and so he was like, "Oh, I'm almost over there," and we kept waiting for him, and he didn't come, and waited like 2 or 3 hours, and he kept saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to arrive there." And it was not like a case where he was constantly forgetting things and such. I actually overheard him one time where he was laughing that he kind of like made us wait for that. After that, those situations, we obviously drifted apart. I don't know exactly what his problem, but he liked to do that to different people. He liked to make them wait. But before that, he was a somewhat decent guy, somewhat. So we were actually playing Hexen in the Nintendo 64. We actually managed to finish that entire game from start to finish. We were 3 players. I was playing as the cleric, Parias, if I'm not mistaken, that's the name, and the other player was the wizard Menelkir, and he was the fighter. I think he was Baracus, that's the name. But as I was telling you, this player was horrible at trying to move the character around, because for those of you that do not know Hexen is basically a first-person shooter, but with sort of like a dark fantasy theme. So it's very similar to Doom, to Heretic. It's actually the sequel to Heretic, and he was playing as this fighter, Baracus. And I really thought this guy has to be trolling, but no, he actually really had problems when it comes to spatial moving around and understanding distances and such. So it was very difficult for us to get him to be effective as a fighter. He needed to be the tank of the group. He always had a lot of health and full mana because all of the weapons are powered by mana, but he always had to move almost like as he was some sort of chess piece. He was terrible at moving around in first-person shooters. You know, you need to move around diagonally, whatever it takes, jump, duck. So he always had to like move in straight lines. He kind of couldn't get the thumbs in sync or in coordination, and so he always had to like move like a chess piece, like almost zigzagging instead of being more fluid. So it was terrible. Every time we saw enemies, we were like, "Oh yeah, let's take them on," and he always like moved in a straight line, and if the enemy wasn't in front of him, he would basically bump into a wall and he would get somehow stuck. He got very confused. So it was terrible. We basically were fighting a group of monsters, and I remember the mage was flying around. We had like if I remember correctly, because I don't know if it's in Hexen 2 or 1, there was this ring of like a crow or a raven, and when you put it on, you can actually fly. I think it was a pair of wings. Well, wings or a ring. He had something that allowed him to fly, and he was flying around being chased by some flying enemies, and these green serpent-like dragon serpents shooting fireballs at him, and I was being chased around by other enemies. I think it was a really large group of two-headed, they were like Edens, and I only had my little mace. My mana had run out completely. And then we were like, "Oh, come on, man, you need to take care of them." The warrior was in full health and with full mana, and he was getting constantly stuck in every nook and cranny and niche in the wall that you can imagine. It was ridiculous. Terrible. Now, this other story also concerns that same guy. I was the game master. We were playing. It was a campaign that was going to make a jump between Forgotten Realms, Faerun and Ravenloft. And every time he played as a fighter, and he was playing with this other player that also played as the wizard in Hexen, and he was a druid. So in every room that they were going to get into, the fighter always wanted the druid to go first. All the time. And the druid was like, you're the fighter, man, you need to do something. I have my healing spells, I have my summoning spells, I can do something if you need help, but you're the one who's fighting up front. And he was always like, no, it's too dangerous. What if there's something magical? The druid needs to take care of it. And he was always making the druid to go inside of the encounters. and only when the enemies had the druid completely surrounded, then he would go in and kept on fighting. He started to use his sword. He loved using his sword and shield, but it was quite terrible. And basically, the only reason why he kept doing this is because he didn't want his character to die. It was quite ridiculous. Eventually, his character got eaten by a hydra, but the other player actually lost 2 or 3 characters because he simply refused to tank. It was ridiculous that he was so in love with that character. If you're going to play as a fighter, well, play as a fighter. Don't play as the rogue or the wizard. Quite terrible. I think that's a very important point of terrible tanks. They usually, and that's sort of like connects with what Drudenfusz says, that she said, I like to play tanks because they are fun. So in order to have fun as a tank, as some people think that they just need to keep themselves alive, but the tank is a role that requires some self-sacrifice, in my opinion. You need to be there to protect your allies. You need to have that sense of being a protector or a guardian. But sadly, I think there are a lot of players, both in tabletop role-playing games and in video games, that they choose that particular role because they think they will have more survivability. That is, they look at spellcasters and they see, oh, they have very few hit points. I'm going to die almost immediately. And they just choose the fighter or the paladin or whatever because they think they're going to stay alive longer. They're going to complete the entire campaign that way. And this other is an example of terrible tanking, and this was with that same player, but not the player that controlled the fighter, but the wizard. He actually wanted to try to tank once, and this time we were playing Baldur's Gate in PlayStation 2, Dark Alliance. This time he decided to play as the dwarf, and I played as the arcane archer. And it was quite funny because I think he still needed to adjust to play as a tank, because he usually always played as sort of like a spellcaster or rogue type of character. And so imagine this is me and this is him, and we were always going forward, and he was here protecting the front line. And when an enemy appeared, he basically did this. He immediately switched sides, so that I basically had to tank as the arcane archer. And I was like, no, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I was just giving you space so that you could use your arrows. But it was terrible. I would have preferred him to tackle the enemy in front, and then that he gave me some space later on to flank around and use my arrows or whatever. But we actually finished Baldur's Gate. But almost all of the game I had to tank, and he just like went in front and the enemy appeared and he ran backwards. It was particularly difficult against the displacer beasts, and if I'm not mistaken there were some ice giants. It was a very difficult, and we actually finished the game in hard mode. It was even more difficult because of that. I think we should have played in normal, so that he got a bit more adjusted to that. But still, I still kind of like, it brings a smile to my face because those were some funny moments. Maybe as I communicate them to you, they don't seem as funny, but back then it was somewhat hilarious. As I was telling you, the way that this other guy kept getting stuck inside different walls and rooms and corridors. He just kept moving towards the walls. He was some sort of robot or automaton. And the enemies were all surrounding us, and he was basically doing nothing. We actually joked around that we said that we played Hexen, the 3 of us, but the 2 of us, that is me and the wizard, actually finished the game. The other one was just there to serve as some sort of decoy. So yeah, I just wanted to share those somewhat funny moments, and to give some thoughts on tanking. And it's really, I think it is more satisfying to tank in tabletop role-playing games because of that freedom that you can do. You can do so many things, anything that you can think of. You can get quite creative, but it's still, there is some enjoyment in video games that you work within that narrow rule set, that you cannot go past what is programmed in the game. So well, thanks for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And if you had some funny tanking moments or experiences, please share them in the comments or make a video or whatever. See you later.